start with our ground rules for the Cities on the Frontline sessions. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these, but let me just remind everyone, though, for those that are new with us today. Um, the purpose of these global seminars is to have an open and honest learning conversation. The calls are not on the record, and we ask that you do not attribute any comments unless you have the person's express permission to do so. We can help you obtain this permission if needed. We have about 200 registered participants on the call today, so to facilitate the discussion, we ask you to write your questions with the help of the WebEx Q&A function. Please note that the recording of the sessions, as well as the session materials, will be available online by next week. So today I'm very honored to be in this space with my colleagues from the North America region who have been working together to address systemic racism in cities. You can imagine that this has not been easy work for any of us, but the Racial Equity Through Resilience community of practice has truly been a safe haven for people to come and talk about their challenges and to share solutions. And often it has been a space where we help each other identify systemic racism. Because when you have lived in a system your whole life, sometimes it's very hard to even know what decisions were made by others before us that got us to where we are today. And to understand that we too have power to make decisions to change our world for the better. So this community of practice has been really instrumental in helping us navigate through some of those ideas. The need for this space, unfortunately, seems to be more and more important. We came together after the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, and have been meeting regularly ever since that time. I'd like to thank the community of practice for helping to create the space for us to talk about this subject today. Over the summer, there were 5 meetings in a row where we literally met immediately following a mass shooting, including the Uvalde school shooting in Texas and a mass shooting in the city of Tulsa, one of our member cities. Even before that, however, Crystal Reyes from Tulsa and Megan Sparks from Atlanta started to curate a special session on violence intervention and brought in Megan's colleague from Atlanta, Jaquel Clemens-Moore. And I'll just introduce our speakers for you today before we get started. So Megan Sparks is a visionary leader with boundless energy for driving equitable growth and resilience among people, organizations, and communities. Megan serves as the Senior Director of the Division of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships in the Office of Atlanta's Mayor Andre Dickens. In this role, Megan and her team work to drive greater equity, resilience, and improved quality of life for Atlantans, especially the most vulnerable, historically disinvested, by building strategic, innovative, multi-stakeholder initiatives. She works across Mayor Dickens' team to develop creative public-private partnerships, and she serves as point person for many of the city's philanthropic and community partners. Megan is also one of the co-creators of the Resilient Cities Network, Racial Equity Through Resilience Community of Practice. And now Jaquel Clemens-Moore, who we're delighted to have on the stage, on the platform with us today. Thank you, Jaquel, so much for joining us. Jaquel is the Director of Mayor's Office of Violence Reduction, City of Atlanta. And she was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, and inherited an ethic of community service from her grandmother, an active community member in the city's 3rd Ward. She is a public health professional with more than 20 years of experience. She has created and implemented public health initiatives that centered communities and healing. And also, Jaquel is the inaugural director of the City of Atlanta's Office of Violence Reduction. Our chair of the Racial Equity Through Resilience Community of Practice, Ron Harris, is traveling today and could not be with us, but he wanted to share a message with you about the community of practice and what it means to him. Ron is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Minneapolis, where he leads the development and implementation of the city's resilience strategy with a key emphasis on racial equity, economic inclusion, and climate change adaptation. I'm going to ask Nicole if she wouldn't mind teeing up the message from Ron, and we can take a listen to that now. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Ron Harris, and I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Minneapolis, and I'm so proud to be the co-founder and chair of the Racial Equity Through Resilience Community of Practice. Now, as a community of practice, we are a coalition of urban resilience practitioners joined by community, academic, philanthropic, and private sector leaders in pursuit of a common goal: to achieve effective racial equity through the lens and the process of resilience. Back in January of 2020, or the before times as I like to call it, I began to regularly meet with Resilient Cities Network staff to finalize the Resilient Minneapolis Plan, which was our city's strategic resilience and adaptation document. By mid-March, COVID had changed all of that. And COVID was actually the stress that exacerbated the resilience challenges that the strategy was intended to address in the first place. As conditions worsened in cities all across the planet, on Memorial Day weekend of that year, the unimaginable happened in Minneapolis. George Floyd was brutally murdered at the hands of a police officer, which sent shockwaves in cities all across the globe. Immediately, this network, especially many of the folks you hear from today, rushed to offer support to me and my city as both a colleague and as a friend. These folks kept me sane, kept me grounded, kept me focused, and kept me encouraged. Oftentimes, efforts like these are one-time or episodic in nature, but this network and these group of people proved to be otherwise. Now, as we collectively participated in response and recovery efforts in our respective cities, we realized that this network of practitioners and equitable resilience more broadly must have a role in shaping our new normal and shaping our new world. Resilience must be our path forward. We knew that this new world had to be more honest, more connected, more just, more responsive. We also knew that cities who are inequitable will always be in recovery, constantly surviving, but never actually thriving. We knew that without true equity, our cities could never be resilient. And I knew that the support that I received during a time where my city's resilience was tested the most is the exact kind of support that other leaders would need as they navigated their own resilience challenges. In our ambitious effort to shape a different world, we sought to practice and model the values that we'd like to see in that new world. We brought together a diverse group of leaders and practitioners from all across North America to create this community of practice, and we've met weekly or bi-weekly consistently for the better part of 2 years. We prioritize building authentic and trusting relationships with each other, no matter how long it took to get there, because we knew that we would have to rely on each other for the long haul. We've created intentional space for folks to share and own their own truths, because we all have something valuable to contribute and voices that need to be heard. We've shared tools, we've shared frameworks, we've workshopped different presentations with each other to make sure that we were prepared to lead our cities in these efforts. We wrestled through difficult and thorny issues and demonstrated that progress is still possible, even in the midst of disagreement. And we ensured that we centered equity in everything that we sought to do. Now, this is a true community of common values, common vision, common struggles, common purpose, and a common love for people. And I believe that the world could use a little bit more community. Now, stay tuned for upcoming opportunities to join our community of practitioners working to achieve racial equity through resilience. And thank you for joining today's important conversation. I think you'll see pretty quickly why I'm so proud to be a part of this community. They remind me week after week that there's nothing that we can't do so long as we're doing it together. See you all next time.
Thank you, Ron. And you can see why we love showing up to our community of practice every week to talk and share ideas and to connect and to grow together. In a recent community of practice call, we held a special session on community violence intervention. And as I mentioned, Crystal Reyes from Atlanta was, I keep saying Atlanta, Crystal is from Tulsa. I'm looking at folks from Atlanta. So Crystal Reyes was part of that call. Unfortunately, she's also traveling today as well as is Ron, and couldn't be with us. But I thought that she shared some really excellent and important framing for the conversation. And so I'm going to share with you Crystal's thoughts from our previous session. And so I cannot take any credit for these ideas. This is all Crystal. But basically, we talked about how urban resilience is the ability to survive, adapt, and thrive through chronic stressors and acute shocks. And we had been talking in our community of practice about community violence as both a shock and a stress, similar to what the pandemic has been for everyone. And we've been asking, how can we bring the lens of resilience to these issues? What does a resilience approach look like in an issue that affects all of our cities? So today we wanted to provide a space for practitioners to unpack drivers to community drivers to community violence, and see the links to our resilience strategies that we're all implementing in our communities. And it's important to name and say things that are in our heads and our hearts. It's often difficult to say them to yourself, and it's often difficult to say them out loud to others. So the questions that we are naming are, what can we do to keep this from happening? Why do these things keep happening? And in this context, we're talking about mass shootings or any form of community violence. So again, today's session is about a space. It's not a planning meeting. It's not a brainstorming session. It's a space for us to continue to ask questions. It is an extension of our learning community and a space for all of us to sit with the questions and take them back to our teams and our cities and our community partners to explore further. And so we talk about issues related to the dimensions of resilience that we learn through our Resilient Cities strategy development work. Dimensions such as social stability, security, justice, cohesive and engaged communities, and economic prosperity. We wanted to focus on two specific dimensions today. The first being cohesive and engaged communities. And cohesive communities are connected to each other and connected to services and supports. So the question is, how can disconnection lead to violence in communities? And we have the subdrivers of community, social connectivity, local identity and culture, and community participation that we can use as prompts to help us work through some solutions. And the second dimension is promoting leadership and effective management. So within that dimension, we have the subdrivers of representation in city governments, voting, policymaking, and participation in systems of decision making. These two dimensions are things that can be at a very micro level and at systemic levels. And there are so many other dimensions that exist that contribute to a resilient community, a community that is safe, or a community that is violent. And so we don't want to limit our thinking to these two dimensions alone, but these are some of the ways that these are some things that we wanted to offer as a framing for how we have been exploring our discussions together. And with that, I would now like to turn the floor over to Megan and Jaquel, who will walk you through their presentation. Megan, Jaquel, over to you.
Thank you, Lorian. And hello, everyone from wherever you may be around the world today. We are so glad that you joined us for a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and I know to my colleague, Jaquel, to her heart as well. And that is, as Lorian was saying, what is causing the violence in our communities and what can we do to prevent it moving forward? In Atlanta, we have a couple of ideas about that we hope will help us both intervene in the violence happening day by day in our communities and ultimately reduce and prevent that violence moving forward. Nicole, next slide, please. These are a few of the statistics that drive us every day, and I won't read every one of these to you. I know that they're different community to community around the world, but here in the US and particularly in the Southeast, violence, gun violence especially, is a public health crisis. As Lorian noted, it is also an equity crisis. And we often state that we are facing three different public health epidemics, pandemics at the same time. COVID, of course, being one, racial equity being another, and violence, particularly gun violence. Here in Atlanta, 83% of the victims of gun violence over the past 5 years have been Black, and that number is going up every single day. We know that nationally in the United States, Black people are 10 times more likely to die by gun homicide than white people are, and every 11 minutes in this country, a Black person is shot and wounded. So these are what drive us moving forward. Nicole, next slide, please. So this question of why, I get this question all the time. I know Jaquel gets it all the time too, particularly when we see mass shootings happening on what can feel like a weekly or all too frequent basis across the country. And one of the answers to that question is that gun violence particularly is both an acute shock, but also a chronic stressor for our communities within the resilience framework. We hear a lot in the media and our day-to-day work about the resilience of the survivor, of the survivor's loved ones, but we don't often think about the resilience of the solutions and the systems that can support those solutions. Next slide, please. You see in front of you the city resilience framework, and what we sought to illustrate for you here is simply that all of these different components that make up a resilient community that we think about every day are the exact same components that need to be present within our violence reduction ecosystem. So everything from physical and mental health, yes, but housing, the health and quality of our neighborhoods, education, leadership, finances, behavioral health. Violence has been proven to be a public health problem, and we can treat it as such. So one of the reasons as to why does this keep happening? Why do we see violence cluster? Why, when there is one shooting in a community or mass shooting, do you almost immediately see another one? The answer to that, at least one answer, is that violence spreads exactly like a disease does, and it is a contagion in our communities. And by addressing it as such and taking a resilient approach and framework, we can make a real dent in the violence that we see every day. So with that, I'm going to ask for the next slide and pass it over to my colleague, Jaquel, who is my favorite person in City Hall.
Thank you, Megan. And I also just want to take this opportunity to thank the Resilient Community Network for having me today. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you to discuss this very important issue that's plaguing all of us. As my colleague stated, violence is certainly a public health issue. And when we think about gun violence and the prevalence of it, what we wanted to do was share with you our 2021 homicide stats for the city of Atlanta. 158 homicides happened here in Atlanta last year. 392 of those were reported shootings. 392 reported shootings were non-fatal. But then something that's really interesting is that for every violent injury, for every homicide, there's at least 94 violent injuries. So that number gets exacerbated when you think about like firearms and violent crime. So this could be attempted suicide, suicides, or any unintentional death and other injuries. Also of note, I think that it's worth raising that since this is an international community, that 45,000 Americans were killed in acts of violence in 2020. That's about a 15% increase from 2019. So nationally, the US is one of the outliers when you think about countries that are experiencing gun violence. And for us, it's really important that we consider this work in from a public health framework. Nicole, would you go to the next slide? And considering that framework, this is where we think about the predictability of gun violence. If we're using public health science and methodology to identify risk and patterns, it provides us with an opportunity to also consider prevention and what could be a multidisciplinary approach. Next slide, Nicole. So here's just a couple of things about violence as a public health issue. It's one of the number one causes of death of children between the ages of 1 to 19. It's totally unreported. Here in Atlanta, about 80% of our violent injuries are not reported to police. It is certainly something where we see a real equity issue, where it's marginalized communities, young, Black, and poor people are most impacted. And again, it's predictable and preventable. Nicole, next slide. So as Megan indicated earlier, if we're thinking about violence and the manifestation of accumulated harm and hurt and trauma as a public health issue, this gives us an opportunity to prevent with tools that are beyond law enforcement. The over-reliance on police allows us to the rethinking of the reliance of police allows us to kind of dial back and deploy different layers of prevention. It allows us to intervene and stop harm, to prevent transmission through exposure and prevent transmission through further violence, and to address exposure with mental health opportunities, trauma-informed strategies, and to build on the resilience of communities, which is why I'm really happy that there's resilient communities across the world that are considering what their play in this work is. Nicole, next slide. So Megan.
Yes, thank you, Jackwell. So, one of the things that fascinates me, and as I started learning about what causes violence and violence is a public health issue, what really grabbed my attention is that the greatest predictor of violence is violence. So, all the time, perhaps in your city as well or your organizations, leaders are trying to figure out how do we predict and stop violence when in fact it's clustering and spreading like a disease. So, if you think back to the heat map that we saw a few moments ago on one of the slides, it looks very, very similar to what a map of COVID transmission rates in 2020 would have looked like in Atlanta. You can think of it very similarly. Gun violence occurs most frequently within informal social networks. So we're talking about people who know each other, people who may have a conflict or an argument or some sort of other long-standing disagreement between them, and someone happens to have a gun, or someone went and sought out a gun in order to resolve that conflict with violence rather than peacefully. Also, what happens is when it can feel like in the community that it's not safe and there's violence everywhere, the reality is that there's a very small percentage of people within most communities who are at highest risk for perpetrating and being victims of violence. So it's the same people in these informal social networks over and over. When we think about violence, too, I think most of us as resilience practitioners as well, there are different kinds of violence. So usually we're talking about interpersonal violence. One person or persons have harmed someone else. But when we think about frameworks of violence prevention and violence intervention, it's important to remember the structural violence. So these are the things that we often may refer to as systemic bias or systemic discrimination. In the US, systemic racism quite often, and historical and intergenerational violence. And that's what the cartoon you see on your screen refers to. That in childhood, when you're exposed to adverse childhood experiences, often that is a cycle that repeats itself over and over and over. So you see the parent or the adult caretaker in this image saying, hey, like my childhood wasn't that great either. And the kids around him saying, like, that sounds really familiar, right? And this is in one way that cycles perpetuate themselves. In our most disinvested communities here in Atlanta and across the US, that usually means, very plainly speaking, poor and Black communities. These three kinds of violence intersect and compound one another so that in order to truly have resilient communities, we have to have equity, particularly racial equity. We have to have safety, yes, but that safety requires wellness and public health across the board. Nicole, next slide. Jacquel?
Thanks, Megan. And I love what you just said. I just want to like piggyback on that for a little bit. The thing that is like, I love the explicit way in which we're speaking about the root causes of what we're seeing in terms of gun violence. And that when we talk about gun violence, it's really important to talk about, you know, like what's at the root. Like, it's oppression, it's the disinvestment in communities, it's poverty, and who that is actually impacting. And I think that like, disproportionately it's impacting communities of color, Black people. And I just want to like piggyback on that and high five you there. So, in terms of like community-based anti-violence strategies that we're considering for the city of Atlanta, we're really wanting to make sure that my office, the Office of Violence Reduction, is looking at programming that are evidence-based and evidence-informed. I think oftentimes we want to find things that are evidence-based, but the evidence isn't there because this is a new practice for us. This is a new practice in thinking about non-enforcement ways to support communities to reduce gun violence, right? And so evidence-based, community informed, and by being community informed, that means that we are using the voices of those most impacted to animate the work, and comprehensive, and that is trauma informed and reduce the greatest risk of gunshot victimization. And so what we have here in this slide is something that we borrowed from the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform here in the States. And this is a really amazing way that a framework that they're using to describe the work ahead. I think that oftentimes when people are thinking about how do we reduce gun violence, and there's the urgency to be responsive to this, we want to kind of like go fast and quick, but this isn't a long-term investment. And so we're thinking about our work in terms of violence reduction in the city of Atlanta, in terms of prevention, intervention, and community transformation. So violence in general is perpetuated by high-risk groups that may constitute for less than like what we may estimate. So maybe like 1% of the population that's actually committing gun violence in communities. And so in order to create a near-term reduction, there's the need for interventions. Interventions such as gun violence, group violence intervention, force deterrence, violence interrupters, street outreach programs, hospital-based violence interventions, which we'll get more into in the next slide. There's a real need to invest in those, and those types of investments usually have a 1 to 3 year turnaround in terms of reaping the benefits of those type of near-term reductions. And then when we think about prevention, those are your long-term violence intervention strategies. Those are the things that we're doing with young people to do like mentoring programs, or to encourage young people to, consider academic gains and to do cognitive behavioral therapy. Those are things that require a little bit more time in order to see a return on that investment. And the end game is, of course, community transformation. And I think that this is where like your resilient communities really gel well with the work that we're trying to do in terms of economic development and neighborhood revitalization. Nicole, next slide. Excuse me. So just a little bit about the type of interventions that exist. Community violence interventions are all using public health approaches to violence to change behavior and social norms around gun violence. And so there are things that are very impactful that the city of Atlanta is hoping to implement. We're currently looking to stand up a violence intervention model by the name of Cure Violence. Cure Violence is a global model that uses a public health approach to reduce gun violence. It is basically street outreach workers, violence interrupters who are like on the ground in communities. It's very place-based. Although when they were developing this model, it wasn't something that was like, I don't think that the consideration was for how the language around place-based strategy was not there. But now this is something that I think they were ahead of their times in terms of thinking about what place-based strategies could look like, making sure that people from the community are the ones that are intervening as credible messengers. They're working with justice-impacted individuals to also carry the message of reducing crime and violence in their communities. Gun violence intervention models are remarkable and have a strong track record for reducing homicides. And essentially a gun violence intervention strategy is sort of like a focused deterrence effect where like you want to bring in those who are high risk and offer them opportunities to redirect their lives. You offer them, you build a relationship with them, communicate a strong message that the shooting must stop. And importantly, that this message is not just coming from law enforcement, but the message is coming from victims of gun violence, people who have been impacted by gun violence, former perpetrators of gun violence, and giving those who are high risk an opportunity to kind of consider what might be an alternate lifestyle for them. And then hospital-based violence interventions, which are really amazing, and what I call our ground zero for violence reduction, are interventions that are actually in the hospital. The strategy there is to try to reduce recidivism and to consider like how can you support someone who's been impacted by gun violence, either who has been experienced a fatal shooting or a non-fatal shooting, or a family that has experienced a homicide. And so what happens at hospitals is that at the bedside, excuse me, at the bedside, patients are met with a person who may have been at high risk previously engaged in gun violence, they go to the bedside of that patient. They engage them on how to redirect their life. They call that time the golden moment. And during that moment, they talk with that person's loved ones and their family and friends about how to redirect and how to get engaged in other activities. They offer trauma-informed services. They also try to encourage and advocate for safety, relocation, anything that might redirect that young person or that young adult. So this is like all of these interventions have been really effective in reducing gun violence within 1 to 3 years. Next slide, Nicole. So we are in the process of rolling out a street outreach program here. And the street outreach initiatives are really amazing because, again, this is like your place-based strategy. You want to try to identify organizations that are within those communities or that have a relationship with the community to broker peace, to encourage personal action, to create peace in their communities. The goal there is also to interrupt the cycles of gun violence by considering behavioral change and offering positive behavioral alternatives. So that might be that like a street outreach group may be a group that just canvass the community. They may do events, community events to increase connectedness, sense of cultural pride. They also try to work with highest risk individuals to link them to um, life coaching or alternative things that might cognitive behavioral therapy, counseling, things that might kind of support redirection again. And again, these street outreach initiatives, they also strengthen the infrastructure of those communities and contribute to the long-term health and positive outcomes within that community. Next slide, Nicole. Excuse me, I need it. Megan, this is you.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to thank you, Jacquel, for joining us when I know you're suffering a bug over at your house as well. So, the journey around violence prevention and violence intervention here in Atlanta has been several years now. And while it's laid out linearly on your screen, it is much more cyclical and waving back and forth. I don't want to give the implication or impression that you go step one to step two, step three without having to go back to step two every once in a while. But here in Atlanta, this work started back in 2016 and it was really resident and community driven. So it was residents within a neighborhood planning unit, which is an organizational system we have here in Atlanta, who were experiencing a lot of gun violence. And they worked with philanthropists and community-based organizations in their area to look across the globe and say what interventions work in addition to law enforcement. So this is not to the exclusion of law enforcement, but really an and both approach. They identified, as Jacquel referenced before, a global organization, Cure Violence Global, and their community violence intervention model. It's one of several models. They worked through 2017, 18, and 19 fundraising for that program, doing the research, working with other organizations, doing the groundwork, and they launched it in early 2020, which, as we know, happened to coincide with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. It also here in the US, unfortunately, coincided with a number of different murders of Black Americans by law enforcement. Violence spread in our community and got more and more attention from leadership, both nationally, regionally, and in the city of Atlanta with the pandemic. The White House here in the US chose to allow community violence interventions and public health based approaches to violence intervention to be an allowable expense supported by federal COVID relief funds. So the former mayor here in Atlanta, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, made the determination that Atlanta was going to devote a portion of its relief dollars to standing up additional community violence intervention programs, also to bringing Jacquel on board and starting the mayor's office of violence reduction. So since that point, Jacquel joined us at the end of 2021. We have been working together to really educate our stakeholders inside City Hall, as well as across the community, about what this approach looks like and how it integrates with more traditional approaches of law enforcement. We are very happy to say that we've moved through many of our required procurement processes and hope to be able to make an announcement around new violence intervention programs here in Atlanta very soon. Um, but it is a continual journey on educating around this. As Jaquel explained and emphasized before, we're looking at behavior change here. And we all know from our experiences in our organizations that that is not an easy thing. Violence is a learned behavior. So a lot of this work is about meeting people where they are, building trust with them, and then learning the circumstances and context of their lives and their communities to help identify alternative, more positive routes than gun violence. But we have to remember that too often in trying to find solutions, we end up dehumanizing people and their experiences. So that is a continual journey for us as we continue to work through this. Next slide, please. And Jaquel, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Megan. So this is a draft of our program integration that we are planning. We have spent a considerable amount of time building awareness. And I will say that you know, the community engagement component of this is really critical, has been really critical for us as we build out our ecosystem of organizations and learning and changing hearts and minds, like getting people to really like buy into what this looks like is different. And it requires, as Megan just stated, like, you know, for us to consider to like really, and Lauren, you said this earlier, to like really like, you know, have a conversation with ourselves and check our hearts around like, you know, who we extend empathy to. I think oftentimes like when we think about gun violence, it's you know, it's very much like we don't think about the traumatic experience or the amount of exposure that people may have experienced that may have led them to perpetrating or being victims of gun violence, right? And so we've spent a lot of time like just trying to increase awareness as like our immediate and most urgent thing. Like, why is this needed? Why should we be talking about root causes of gun violence? The move away um, from just law enforcement to a more blended approach of, you know, using non-enforcement and enforcement. So that's been a lot of like the foundational work for my office. And so some of the things that we've done is there's been lots of training of people who want to be responsive in this work. We've done several Office of Violence Reduction webinars and chats. We did Peace Week Atlanta. Peace Week Atlanta was done to ground the work because I think that it's really easy for us to focus on what it is that we don't want and not what it is that we want, which is peace. And so we grounded the work of this office in Peace Week, and we've been doing a lot of work around educating philanthropic partners, community-based organizations, and other legislators and people who have strong political will and want to be responsive. Um, and then we also have kind of began to move into a little bit of our intervention work where we're doing Stop the Bleed trainings. Stop the Bleed trainings have been done by our partners at Grady Hospital. It's a training that is provided by the American College of Surgeons. And essentially what it does is it teaches, it's just sort of like your active shooter response. It teaches you literally like how to stop the bleed. And what that does is it really increases community awareness about how they can be proactive members in reducing gun violence. We're also, as Megan mentioned, in the procurement process to fund street outreach and life coaching. We're building a crisis response network out of those organizations that are going to be awarded those funding. And then we've been really intentional about building support for frontline workers, the people who are actually doing the work. And you're talking about a group that requires resilience. These are people who are experiencing a tremendous amount of vicarious trauma because of the work that they're doing, because of their responsiveness to gun violence. And so we've created what we call Brave Space in order to support them. The city of Atlanta, at the beginning of our current administration, Mayor Andre Dickens, he formed a nightlife division. And the nightlife division, where a lot of our crime and violent activity is also occurring, is was created to support nightlife and entertainment establishments around gun violence. And so some of the things that we're doing is providing assessment and reviews for those establishments and supporting them with interventions and like such as lighting, or if there's been a violent incident in their at their establishment, we may go in with providing some trauma support and services for the people who work there. And so, Megan.
Sorry, my computer didn't want to come off mute. Thank you. Um, in addition to the awareness and intervention, we are working on prevention approaches as well as transformational approaches. It's really important that we remember to do all four of these things. Often working with funders and community members who are really eager and excited to support this work, you'll hear, I want to do a mentoring program for young students. I want to work with athletic leagues, and that's going to stop gun violence. And it is important. And it is a piece of the puzzle that may help prevent gun violence in the future, but it's not going to stop the most impactful and traumatic violence that's happening day to day. So it's really important that we continue to remember and both moving forward here. I know that we are short on time, so Nicole, if you'd like to move to the next slide. I'll just thank our hosts again for having us here today. Jacquel and I, as I'm sure you can tell, are very passionate about this work and could continue to talk about it all day. But I think we'll pause here and hand the floor back to Lorian and Nicole, and we're happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you so much, Megan and Jaquel. As I was listening to you speak, I was really struck by the amount of data that you have presented, but also the amount of data that's out there for us all to draw on. I don't know that I've heard the data presented in quite that way before. The statistic that it's 1% of the community really that we need to be reaching, and we could make such an incredible change in people's lives by reaching 1% of the community was really staggering and eye-opening for me. And I'm wondering, as you were talking, I kept wondering, there's so much information that we know how we got here. We know why this happens, but what we don't necessarily know is what more can we do, what more is needed. But then on that last slide you showed, I mean, that's a very clear laid out plan for what more we need to do. And so it's really fantastic to see such a comprehensive strategic plan laid out with budget numbers, by the way, which was going to be one of my big questions. But let's go to some questions from our chat, because I want to make sure we get to everything as well. And one of the questions is that we know that violence is very culturally specific, and we've been talking about, in particular, gun violence in a city in the United States. And remind me again, how large is the city of Atlanta? What's the population?
Oh.
The population within the city limits is right around 500,000 at this point, but often in Atlanta, one of the challenges is in many big cities is that we might have city limits and jurisdictions, but really this is a region. And that is multi-millions of people.
Okay.
And then we also find in Atlanta that it is such a beacon for people who love culture and nightlife and entertainment and all the things that Atlanta has to offer, that we may find that we have a shooting or a violent incident and none of the participants even live in Georgia, let alone in the city of Atlanta.
Okay. Okay. And I asked you just to give us some context context of the scale of what you're trying to manage. So the question, I'm going back to the question now, which was about cultural nuances between cities, and especially American cities versus other cities in the world outside of the United States. And you did touch on this a bit with your reference to the Casey Foundation work and exploring globally other models, but I wonder if you could expand upon that a little bit. What do you think that cities in other countries can learn from the way that American cities are trying to make their communities more resilient to the realities of gun violence? And what do you think American cities have learned and can continue to learn from our international counterparts?
Um, I'll take a stab at that, and then I'd love to hear Jacquel's thoughts as well, because I can see her brain moving in the video. I mean, actually, I would say that it is, from my understanding of the history of this work, in many ways, it is American cities learning from cities around the world. So
Yeah.
the Cure Violence Global model originated in Chicago here in the US, but they took their inspiration from global public health work that had happened in a number of different countries and regions globally. And that model has also been applied globally in a number of different locations: South America, Latin America, Europe, Africa. Um, so that data around efficacy of these programs as compared to control groups is really international and global data. And I would argue that it's many American cities that are playing catch up in learning about this work and violence as a public health crisis. Jacquel, did you want to chime in there?
I think you nailed it. I mean, that was exactly my thoughts when Lorianne asked that question. I think that, you know, there's a lot that we can learn from other countries in terms of like their peacekeeping activities and the ways that um, I think that like the ways that like other countries have like created like really healing centered environments. So I think that like, you know, we are playing a little bit of catch up. Um, it's interesting to me that like we're number 8 in terms of like international countries that are experiencing gun violence. And so I think that it's it highlights for me that like, you know, that like this is an issue that's now getting the attention of the government. Like it's starting to just in the last 3 years, really kind of get the type of support that it needs and the investment that it needs. And so I think that it's a heavy lift, but it's us doing this work now. But I do think that there's a lot that we can learn from other countries. And I would be curious to hear how other people are approaching gun violence. Like London, I know as a part of the Health Alliance for Violence Interventions. And I'm always impressed when I hear them at conferences when they discuss and talk and share out the type of innovative public health practices that they're able to put into place. That's policy, right? And it's just kind of like a way of life for them. So I think that we still have a lot to learn.
And I do want to just reiterate, emphasize that you are talking about this as a public health issue, which I think is important to just lift that up every time we get a chance to. Um, and so London is a great example. Are there any other countries that you're looking to for ideas and support?
I'm following like you know what London is doing in hospitals, but I'm also kind of considering the work that's happening in Central America with Cure Violence Global, and leaning on our Cure Violence Global team to kind of share their best practices and things that they're finding to be efficacious and working well, and maybe implementing some of those things here. So.
Great, great, thank you. And we have been talking about gun violence specifically, but I imagine, is it fair to say that you could extend the theories and the practices that you're proposing and putting forward to other types of violence as well? As I'm top of mind for me right now is the mass murders in Canada that just happened this week, which was stabbings, not guns, but I don't know, in my mind, is it the same? I'm thinking it's the same issue,
Yeah.
the same traumas we need to be addressing.
Yeah, absolutely, Lauren. When I think about violence in general, I'm certainly thinking about like homicide, violent crime, suicide, attempted suicide, and any like unintentional death or injury. So anything that's intentional, I think that like all of it requires us to take a hard look at those root causes and why, and ask ourselves, like, to Megan's question earlier, like what's at the root of this? Like, what is this about? And to really like do a deeper dive to try to understand what are the drivers of violence and systematic, like I think that when we explore root causes of gun violence, like we can't help but explore the systematic ways in which people experience violence as well.
Well, that's a really great segue to the next question, which I feel like you're here reading my notes. But the question is, what is the impact of violence and trauma on individual and community resilience? And how does the experience of gun violence impact our ability to deal with other urban shocks and stresses?
So I'll take a stab and then I'll pass this to Megan. But I think that this is why a public health approach is really important, right? Because I think if you think about population health, like people are in communities that are experiencing high crime index, high violence index, they tend to have poor physical health, The exposure leads to persistent and chronic PTSD. I think that it impacts our adaptive functioning and our ability um, to be present and in our bodies to make good decisions, which I think, trauma begets more trauma. And so I think that that's really like the overall overarching impact of it. And I think that because like if we're constantly in fight or flight and we're always here and heightened, like people are reactionary. Most of what we're seeing in Atlanta is like very small disputes leading into explosive gun violence, right? And if people's nervous systems are activated, then how do we calmly approach a situation or think about like all of the fallout of our response when we're heightened. So I think that like a large part of that is definitely because of the trauma that people have experienced in many of our communities. Megan, thoughts, ideas?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jacquel. And I would add to that when we think about building resilient communities and cities, many of us who practice this work daily are policymakers and public administrators and nonprofit leaders. And we frankly love the work and we love thinking about the work. And we get caught up in all of the, I call it geeking out or nerding out around that. But when you start thinking really about what is the experience of a person day to day moving through their community, maybe your passion or your goal is to increase educational outcomes or to improve the cohesiveness of a community or to build more resilient infrastructure. And this kind of violence reduction, because that trauma is impacting our residents every day, we have to address it to get any of the other outcomes. People are not, you can't divide the outcome and experience of a person into education versus health versus transportation versus work. It is all one life and experience for them. So we have to address the violence. I'm thinking of a teenager who told us recently when the mayor visited her school that her school felt like the safest place for her, but she couldn't really engage in her classes because she was up all night scared that a bullet was going to come through her window. Um, it's that kind of trauma that impacts all the other things that we're trying to do.
Yeah. That's beautiful, Megan.
It really is. And so we have just a few minutes left, and that leads me to another question, Megan, which is a really practical question. And Jaquel, you talked about, I'm really excited to meet you and to know that you are the inaugural, I've lost the, no, inaugural chief director of the Mayor's Office of Violence Reduction. And that is a huge, that's a huge thing to happen. That's a systemic change. And it's the tip of the iceberg, really, of the change that needs to happen. So I'm really happy that we could have you here today and showcase the big, bold moves that Atlanta is making in this direction. But I know that there will be challenges. And so Megan, you're here, been working on resilience, and Jaquel is connected into our resilience community now, and we're offering as much support as we can. But Megan, you just really clearly articulated how difficult it is, how easy it is to silo out and to parse out the pieces of the urban fabric and how people experience their lives. And how are we going to bring that together? What challenges from a city operational perspective? And you don't have to get too detailed, but what are the big challenges that you think that you need to overcome besides budget? You have an amazing plan laid out. So what more support will you need to be able to achieve the success that we all need to see happen?
Right. Thank you for that question. And I'll be brief because I know Jaquel has thoughts as well. I want to give credit as well as to Jaquel and the advocates on the ground. Our interim police chief, an amazing man named Darren Shearbaum, excuse me, as well as Mayor Andre Dickens here, are two huge advocates for this work. So one of the biggest challenges that we face, in addition to money and resources, is a misunderstanding of what it is we're trying to do. And again, referencing back to what we said before, people thinking that we're trying to supplant law enforcement and responding to crime and police with this work, when in fact what we're trying to do and what our interim chief and other law enforcement officers are begging us for is give them another tool in their toolbox and help address trauma and root causes so that their jobs are easier as well. So I think this really is, and we talk about this in our community of practice a lot too, Lorian, racial equity work is about culture and systems change. And it's that culture change and changes in thinking and perspectives that need to happen from the people who are incredibly well intentioned and dedicated to the work that can sometimes be a challenge for all of us.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yes,
Jaquel,
Megan.
last thoughts?
Yeah, I love everything that Megan said. And I just want to give credit to her because Megan was really instrumental in pushing this work for years prior to me getting here, right? And she's been talking for, I mean, I read all of her notes, but it dates back to maybe even like 3-4 years of just kind of trying to push for this type of work to come from government, right? To come from the mayor's office. And what's happening, so she's pioneering in that way, in that she had the vision for this type of work long before I got here. But what I would also add to all the things that she said is that there's a real need for capacity building of organizations to be responsive to this type of work, and not just organizations, but even government and infrastructure support, to also kind of do this in addition to everything else Megan said around funding, increasing awareness. I think that we are a really richly resourced city, but it's having someone to also kind of put those pieces together to kind of say, hey, strategically, how does all this work is going to be really important. And it's more than my office. It's definitely having someone like Megan in place who knows all the different strategic initiatives so that we're not working in silos and that we're working collaboratively internally and with our stakeholders and the people in the field. So, yes.
perfect words to end on. Thank you so much, Jaquel. Thank you, Megan, for both of you for being here today and sharing such important information. But also, I feel also hope that we have a way forward. And now we just need to keep moving, keep executing, keep thinking about people in and their experiences and not dehumanizing them in our actions moving forward. So much great information. I'm sorry we're out of time, but thank you again. Thank you to the community of practice. For those on the call, if you're interested in joining the community of practice on racial equity through resilience, please go to the Resilient Cities Network website and you can find a form there to request more information. We are happy to open up the community to everyone who wants to be a part of it. Thanks again to Cities on the Front Line for hosting us today. And I would just like to let you know that the next Cities on the Frontline session will take place on September the 22nd, and the topic will be the Resilient Sydney platform. So thanks again for being with us today, and enjoy the rest of your days and evenings, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you.